The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Well, welcome everyone to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. This is your host, David Hendrickson, with co-host
Dan Riveros.
And we have a very special guest with us today, and I'm actually under a little bit of pressure because it's my pastor, senior pastor of Eagles Nest Church in Roswell, Georgia, Lee Jenkins. Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this.
For those of you that have listened to our podcast before, you'll know that Pastor Jenkins was a successful college football player. He played with Reggie White at the University of Tennessee. He played for Bill Belichick and Bill Parcells at the New York Giants before getting hurt. Successful Wall Street banker, successful author, and eventually decided that pastoring a church was sort of the next step on his journey. And as one of his congregants, I can tell you he is in the right spot for sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Now, Pastor Jenkins and I have one point of adversary, which is I'm a Georgia Bulldog fan.
That's right. But I won't hold that against
that's
you.
Right. Other than that, we're usually on the same page.
That's exactly right, except for during football season.
That's right. That's right. So the topic today, everyone, that Dan and I would like to talk to Pastor Jenkins about is really the area of racial reconciliation. And because this podcast really originates with the story of the Good Samaritan, I think this is sort of a relevant topic. And I think I'll give this some context, Pastor Lee, if you don't mind. The very first time my wife and I stepped foot in Eagles Nest Church, you were at the old building in Roswell. And I was super excited to see the church for the first time. You and I have been friends for 5 years. And I walk in and I see Georgia Bureau of Investigation folks. I see armed police officers. Yeah. And I thought, I wonder if that's sort of a regular scenario. And you actually addressed it in your opening comments at church. But you had some strange experiences, which we're going to talk about.
Yes.
But we came shortly after a really tough week in early July of 2016 when Alton Sterling, Philando Castile were both killed in Baton Rouge and Minneapolis, respectively. I think I've got that right. And then the Dallas police officers were killed. And actually, a couple weeks later, a few more Baton Rouge police officers were killed. That was just a tough time for the country.
Yes.
And tell our listeners, if you don't mind, as we kind of lead up to why we're there, armed police officers at church that morning. You made a decision to invite the Roswell police chief to church on that Sunday. Tell our listeners why you made that decision.
Well, that was a tumultuous week. I would say it was one of the worst weeks that I can remember in my adult life. The two black gentlemen got killed by policemen, and they were unarmed, which really angered a lot of people in the African-American community. And then right after that, in retaliation for that, police officers, most of them white, were killed by a sniper who was black. And then some other things happened too. So it was just a very difficult week with emotions flying high, with racial tension being the thickest that I ever remember it being in my adult life. And so I had a sermon already prepared for that week, but once those incidents happened, I decided that I had to change my sermon and address these issues.
Last minute decision.
And so as I began to craft my sermon, which was going to be on race relations, I felt like I was preaching to the choir. In other words, the church that I pastor is about 90% African American, and most of the people that would be listening to me pretty much understood where I was coming from.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say that most of them felt the same way. Now, that's not a problem, except to say that if you're going to help people in this area, you don't need to preach to people who are like you. You need to preach to people who aren't like you. You need to reach across the racial bridge.
Yeah.
So I began to think of who could I call, who were some white influential movers and shakers in the community who needed to hear this message. Now, not because they needed to hear it because the message was all that great. They needed to hear it because they probably needed to hear it from a perspective that was not on television.
Right.
Every black person is not angry and mad and wanted to retaliate.
Well, and just to interject, because I'm anxious to hear where you're headed. Knowing that we were going to have this discussion today, and I have to confess to our listeners, I watched the videos of the live police cams for the first time.
Wow.
You've never seen it before?
I had never seen the Alton Sterling shooting. I had never seen the Philando Castile shooting. For anybody who's listening, if you're going to form a judgment without seeing those videos, I would encourage you to pause and go watch them because it's tragic.
Very tragic, very heartbreaking, broken. I was very heartbroken. So I called the police chief of the city that I lived in and the city that my church is located in. He was a white gentleman, early 60s, and I asked him to come to our church that morning. And I said, if you could bring the entire police force, which is mostly white, that would be great.
Wow.
Now, he respects me a lot. He doesn't know me very well, but he had heard of me. He says, well, Lee, I can't bring the entire police force.
Then we got nobody.
Yeah, we have nobody protecting the city. He said, but I will come.
Yeah.
And he said, well, what am I going to be walking into? I mean, he was really concerned about walking into a predominantly African-American church right after that week. And I said, you're going to experience a couple of things. I said, you're going to experience more love than you probably have ever experienced and respect. But you're also going to hear some things from me that may make you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But my purpose is not to make you feel uncomfortable. My purpose is for you to hear some perspectives that maybe you haven't considered. But I promise you, by the end of the service, you're going to understand where I'm coming from, where we're coming from, and it ought to make us more unified.
Yeah. And just one more interjection, sorry, but when I think of Luke chapter 10 and the story of the Good Samaritan, which is kind of at the heart of how Dan and I are working on this podcast, I sort of view it, this may not be 100% correct theologically, but somebody's walking down the road and they see something messy on the other side. And they might care, but you know what? They're going to keep walking because they don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to get involved in the mess. And what I just wanted to point out was you were like, hey, this might be messy, but we're going to get involved. We're going to engage.
That's a great analogy. The Good Samaritan. Many people, black and white, would say, I'm not going to touch this.
Yeah. Right.
He could have declined the invitation. Yeah. And I didn't have to reach out to him, but I knew we had to engage with each other and dive in the mess. So he accepted the invitation. He came to the church. Everything was going great. He was sitting on the front row as I began to do my sermon. I had already warned him that there are going to be some things that I was going to say that will probably make him feel uncomfortable.
This is the Sunday right after.
The Sunday right after.
So it would have been the 8th or 9th of July, like somewhere around there.
Now, let me tell you why I told him that there were going to be some moments in my sermon that would probably make him feel uncomfortable. Because I started my sermon off by telling a true story of when I was 5 years old and my first confrontation with policemen. And it was not good. Yeah. And it was in South Georgia where I would go to live with my grandparents. And I was with my 7-year-old cousin and my 9-year-old cousin. And to make a long story short, we were walking to the corner store and it was very hot. And we saw kids playing in a swimming pool. And we took off our shoes and our socks and our shirt, and we jumped in the swimming pool. Unbeknownst to us, it was a whites-only park. And
give our listeners, sorry to out you on your age, but give us a time frame because I think they'll be surprised.
Yes, this was 1967.
Yeah.
1967. Whites-only park. And I think I was 5 or 6 years old. And now here's the deal. I remember this like it was yesterday because while we were taking off our shoes and our socks and our shirts, you could hear the kids playing, and all this noise. And I remember jumping in the pool and coming out from under the water, and everything was silent. No more kids laughing. Well, what happened is the parents who were around told their children to get out of the pool. And a few minutes later, here comes a police officer. And he tells us to get out of the pool. He calls us the N-word, and he begins to scream and holler at us. And, of course, I was just 5 or 6 years old, so my height was about the height of his holster. So the gun is like right in my face.
Jeez. And
long story short, as he was screaming and hollering all kind of obscenities at us, I remember 2 things that he did. The first thing he did is he told us to look around. You see these people, they're out of the pool. Now we're going to have to drain the pool because you guys jumped in it. Wow. And then the second thing he did is one of my cousins who was not he was paying attention, but he wasn't looking at him in the eyes. He slapped him. He said, "Boy, look at me when I'm talking to you." That was my first experience in my life with a policeman. Now, you have to understand, prior to that, policemen to me were like Superman or Batman and Robin.
Yeah.
They were superheroes to me. So can you imagine Batman coming up to you and you're 5 years old, or Superman, and you're just like, "Oh my God, it's Superman," and he slaps you and calls your name? That was the impact that moment had on me. So from then on, I never had a healthy relationship in terms of how I viewed police officers, especially white police officers. Yeah. So there was a fear there. And of course, this was reinforced many times throughout my teenagehood, getting pulled over all the time. And even in college, it's a normal way of life in the neighborhood that I grew up in. So I had this background where I could understand 100% why many African Americans had a distrust. But I also knew that most police officers were good, law-abiding, professional people. But it only takes a few bad ones to ruin it. Yeah. But this is an issue that did not need to be ignored. So I went through my stories, went through the sermon, and man, the police chief was squirming on the front row. He was turning all kind of colors. Yeah. But then at the end of it, I wrapped it up, of course, with a gospel message and then invited him up on stage. And me and some of the elders of our church, we prayed for him and we laid hands on him. And it was one of the most touching moments I think I've ever had in ministry. Yeah. And he was just broken to have these black guys loving on him. And so then we gave him the microphone and he said, "I've been in law enforcement for 35 years. He said, "I was with the GBI, which is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, for 25 years and then 10 years as a police chief." He says, "I have learned more in the last 45 minutes about race relations than I have in 35 years. So he thanked us. He said, "We're going to do much better." He got a standing ovation. Well, shortly after that, one of the members of our church called me. And he said, "Pastor Lee," which is what they call me. "Hey, Pastor Lee, since you and the police chief are buddy-buddy now."
Yeah. That's right. And also to interject, the Facebook page from the Roswell police force posted the prayer and highlighted Eagles Nest Church in Roswell, Georgia. And so it was a good experience for the police chief, for the church, and for the police force, I would say.
No doubt. Yeah. In fact, I missed that because the local newspaper picked it up. So it was a picture of us praying for the police chief and so many incredible comments. In fact, there were many of the people who were commenting on the picture and the article, and I could tell that they were white people who were commenting. and just because of some of the language that they use, but it was so complimentary. And this is important.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
This was like, we need more black people like this. We need more black leaders like Lee Jenkins. I was the hero to a lot of white people.
So I have to ask, did you take some hits from
actually, I took
people
some hits
as well for being sort of reconciliatory with the police?
Absolutely. Yeah. I took some hits from some African Americans. In fact, I remember getting one email, not from a person from my church, but it was someone else. How could you allow the enemy in your church? Meaning the police. They're the enemy. So long story short, everything was going well. We got so much positive publicity from that. Yeah. The police chief did, as well as our church and me. Well, a few days later, a parishioner called and he said, "Hey, Pastor Lee, since you and the police chief are buddy, I just thought I'd let you know what's going on. In my neighborhood, there is a police officer who works for the city of Roswell. And the police officer brings the car home most evenings. And right in the front yard is a huge Confederate flag. And I don't mean a small one, huge. And so this person said, how am I supposed to be able to trust a police officer who is so bold enough to bring their car home and park it in front of a Confederate flag? And furthermore, why are they flying the Confederate flag? Yeah. Is that for Southern heritage purposes or Southern hate purposes?
Well, and I've got a long way to go in this area. And with your help, you've been sort of working on me. Yeah. But awareness is so significant. So you had me read America's Original Sin by Pastor Jim Wallace.
Jim Wallace.
And then White Fragility. And then you and I sat down actually for a couple hours, and you let me ask questions and probe. And one of the things that you said to me, and I don't want to interrupt the story, but I bet there are a lot of people not of color who believe there's this sort of Southern heritage, Southern pride support for the Confederate flag. And what you told me was new information, which is, look, Americans don't like to lose. There isn't anybody that flew the Confederate flag after the Civil War was over because it represented the losing side, but it reemerged in the 50s and 60s as sort of a racist white supremacy kind of symbol.
Absolutely. It was in retaliation of a lot of the civil rights legislation. So the Confederate flag was, it reemerged in response to the gains that were being made in the South as it relates to integration. So it wasn't like South Carolina and these states like Mississippi were flying that flag in 1910 or 1920 or no, they didn't start flying those flags till the 1950s, and it was really in protest against the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, which basically outlawed segregation. Yeah. And it overturned another Supreme Court decision.
And so this idea that the African American community is too sensitive or doesn't understand the heritage, artistic, whatever sort of defense, it's just not correct.
No.
The reality is that flag went away and reemerged for the reasons that you mentioned.
Absolutely. Yeah. And flags represent ideologies. Yeah. Ideologies determine people's behavior. So I would tell people this, okay, you are a big Confederate flag proponent. All right. So you want to know why I am not? It's very simple. If the Confederacy had won the war, my family would still be slaves. Period. Boom. Period. I mean, that's just it. Yeah. And slaves were not even considered full human beings. So that's why that flag represents something that is unchristian. Yeah. So
there you go.
And so, you think you can make them understand that?
Yeah, if they spend enough time with me, yes. But Well, my great-great-great-grandfather died for that flag. And okay, I understand that. But everything that we die for is not necessarily a good cause.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people who have died in many wars, and they're good people, but the cause wasn't necessarily...
It was unjust.
Yeah,
sure.
It was unjust.
Yeah.
Okay, so, so once you educate people, so number one, you have to look at why was the war even taking place, the Civil War. Okay, what was the Confederacy really fighting for? And if they had won, what would have been the result? Okay, and it would have been very unchristian, the dehumanization of people, which were African Americans, and we would have been subjected to slavery. And it just and so many other things go with that, with the lack of rights and freedom. And here's the deal: when people say, "Well, why aren't Black people," and we can get into this a little bit later, and this is not all Black people, but why are some of us lukewarm about the Pledge of Allegiance, Star Spangled Banner, all that stuff? Well, you have to understand that our history in the United States is very different than a white person's history. So what we have to do is educate them on our history.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these things, if they were successful, we would still not have the rights that we have. Oh, but here's what I wanted to say. The contradictory nature of America, particularly 130 or so years ago, was really what bothered many African Americans, because let's just take the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for white people. It doesn't say that, does it?
Yeah.
It says liberty and justice for all.
Right.
But it really was not liberty, which is freedom, and certainly wasn't justice for all. And so imagine, like I would often do in elementary school, standing up in the mid to late 1960s, doing the Pledge of Allegiance, knowing that I just had a policeman to call me the N-word at 5 years old, to tell me to get out of the pool, and then that next Monday at school, I have to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. It just didn't make sense to my 5 or 6 or 7-year-old mind.
Sure.
So what I do is I educated people on the flag. So when this person called me, I immediately called the police chief. They looked into it. I'll skip some of the details. They did extensive research on the officer and an investigation internally and externally. And it was determined that this officer needed to be fired. Yeah. Not just for flying the flag, but because of a 20-year track record.
And it seemed in most of the press that I saw that got missed. And I don't know if it was confidential information or the police force couldn't disclose it, but it sure seemed that the headlines that went around the community at that time was an officer was fired for flying the Confederate flag.
Well, they could not disclose all of the information because the officer filed a lawsuit.
And who knows what else it would have disclosed.
That's exactly right. So, so now remember, a week before, I'm getting emails from people saying, "Wow, you are an incredible leader. I wish more Black leaders were like you, to invite a white police officer to your church to pray for him. I was the toast of the town." Well, when this article came out, it said that Roswell police officer fired for flying the Confederate flag. And the way this came about was senior pastor of Eagles Nest Church, a Black senior pastor of Eagles Nest Church, contacted the police chief to alert him to this. Well, within the next 2 to 3 weeks, I got about 100 threats. Many of them were death threats. So when you came to our church...
From all over the country?
Oh, from all over the country. Wow. From all over the country. Mostly from the Southeast. And so when you came to the church, the reason you saw officers and security And I mean, they were probably decked out in bulletproof vest because some of the threats were that serious. And they were there to protect me and to protect our church. So when people tell me that racism and that we are a colorblind society or we're post-racial, I say, have you lost your mind?
Yeah.
I mean, because I have experienced this thing. I have lived this thing. And just a few years ago. And so I got some really hateful mail. Even the ones that were not threatening were so hateful. And, you know, I just can't even begin to tell you how bad they were. But I need to share this one. It's so funny. So one lady said, "You are one of the worst Americans in the world." Okay. Now, this was during the 2016 election. So she said, here are the 4 worst Americans. And she says, first of all, she said Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, because he had just decided at that time that he was not going to support the candidate, Donald Trump.
Gotcha.
So there were so this person said.
So Ted Cruz is on the list.
Yeah, Ted Cruz. Yeah, she said Ted Cruz. And of course, she said, it was a lady, she said Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. And then he said Hillary Clinton. And then she said Lee Jenkins. I say, wow, man,
that's pretty
that's
impressive.
A pretty good company
right?
right there, man. So instead of that letter hurting me, I'm like, man, I have really moved up in the world. I have arrived. I mean, Ted Cruz, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton. I said, man, you know, I don't mind being mentioned in the same breath that they're mentioned in. But nonetheless, just some very demeaning comments like go back to playing football. That's all you're good for. I mean, just all kind of stuff.
Now I have to ask you, and Dan and I I've shared the story with Dan. When you were at the pulpit and you said, "Hey gang, I need to tell you why these folks are here."
Yeah.
You said, I do a lot of work in the racial reconciliation area, and now and again, I get some threats. Mm-hmm. And our church does this thing called the Eagle Mingle, which is sort of shaking hands and hugging and saying hey to everybody before the sermon. And you have a smile on your face and you're kind of laughing and you're like, hey, you might not want to have your hands in your pockets or you might not want to lunge at me too suddenly. And you're laughing. And so you sort of lighten the mood in the church because it was sort of tense, right? Like, man, these armed dudes are here. Mm-hmm. How do you keep your balanced perspective and your dedication to the cause when stuff like that happens?
Well, first of all, I understand that human beings are human beings. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. So I look at racism and these crazy letters I got and phone calls and voice messages like I would look at any other fallen person or any other sin. And so then secondly, a part of leadership, a part of going against the status quo is you have to sacrifice. And sometimes that means you hope it won't be your life, but you know that your life won't be comfortable. And so I never thought I would get death threats. But once it started to happen, I said, if this is the price I have to pay to lead in this area, then I'm willing to pay that price. Yeah. And so the reason I was lighthearted about it is because, first of all, I wanted to calm everybody's fears. But secondly, I really had peace. About that, I knew I was doing the right thing, and I just was not scared. And that is for me to say that, because if you had told me this years and years ago that I would get 100 threats, and some of those, and when I mean threats, I mean some of the stuff was very benign. I mean, you just know that it was, if I ever see you, I'll punch you in the face, But then some of it was like, I know where you live. Yeah. I know where your church is. I remember one person said, don't, and this was what the letter said, and it was, they did not have a return address. It was handwritten, and it says, don't forget Birmingham.
Oh my gosh.
1963. Of course, it was a reference to Birmingham in 1963 when they bombed the churches, the black church. So just little things like that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it was just God's grace. And I knew I was doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And I knew that somebody needed to step out and do it. So after all of those threats, it just drove me and the police chief even closer.
That's good.
Because he had a chance to see, wow, everything I was saying in that sermon, boy, really is true.
Yeah.
And then from there, I started a group of small groups around the city called Conversations. That's what I call the program. It is when predominantly white churches partner with predominantly black churches, and we meet in small groups and talk about race over a 6 to 8 week period. And it was just unbelievable.
Yeah. It feels to me like this is, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, but there's a lot of ups and downs
Yes.
in the work that you do. So you had the up of the invitation to the police chief to come to the church. The church prays for him. The largely African-American church puts hands on him and prays for him. And then you have sort of the down of doing the right thing for the Roswell community and having the investigation and the removal of the police officer, and you get hate mail and death threats, and so we're down again. I don't know how long thereafter, but there's an up, and that is you get an invitation, and you'll have to describe to our listeners the crowd, but you get an invitation to pursue the mayoral office in Roswell.
Yes. So you never know who's watching you. So even though I got a ton of hate mail and some death threats, there were some very influential people in my city that thought that what I was doing was not only brave, but was needed.
Yeah.
And that was trying to get people together to talk and to unify people. And so the mayoral race was coming up, and these people called me to a breakfast. I didn't even know any of them. Out of 20 people, I knew one of them. And now the one guy I told me, hey, man, you're coming to a breakfast. They want to talk to you about running for mayor. And I was like, oh, man, this is a joke, right? So I get to the restaurant. I'm looking around. I know there are hidden cameras around here. I'm being punked like the old show, but they were for real, because I'm like, this must be a joke. But they began to lay out why they thought that I would be the best leader.
So our listeners know, was there a person of color in that
No.
in that meeting?
I was the only person of color.
That's already awkward.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. 20.
Didn't you kind of say, hey, guys, like, are you sure I'm in the right meeting?
Yeah, well, there were a couple of things going on. When they started talking to me about it, I started saying, okay, now these are a bunch of Democrats who are trying to get me to run, because how many people come together without an agenda? So I'm thinking, what's their agenda? Then I say, are there bumps of Republicans? They started to go around the room and introduce themselves to me. And they were from all political parties, different ages, and they all loved the city. And they felt like I would be the best person to bring the city together and to lead the city.
That's awesome.
So they said, Lee, the good news is we've studied your life already. We've seen what you have done, and that's the good news. And this was like on a Tuesday. Okay, they said the bad news is you need to make up your mind by Friday if you're going to do this, because that's the deadline. So I had 3 days to pray and to decide to do it, and I did. I threw my name in the hat. To make a long story short, I ended up getting in a runoff with a 15-year veteran of local politics and lost, but I got 46% of the votes.
I hate to sort of simplify the conclusion here, but I remember the conversation. I called you after the race was over, and I remember two things. You sort of said, for everybody who's listening to the conversation that Dan and Pastor Lee and I are having, and you've already sort of slid into your political narrative, what you told me after that race was, hey, David, there's some real nastiness on both sides, like some dysfunction and some miscommunication, AKA lying. Like, it's hard to sort out.
Yes.
And you also said, I'm pretty sure I lost the race because of my race.
No doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. And I am not one to make up excuses.
And you had the endorsement of the previous mayor, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yes, had the endorsement of the previous mayor. You see, racism takes on many forms, and one of the things that was leveled against me stuck, even though it was a lie, but it stuck because I was Black, because I was African American. And I'll just throw out a couple of them. You know, when there are code words out there that are more easily attributed to Black people, for instance. And I'm not saying anything is wrong with these words, but I'm just saying, Roswell is 85% white, conservative, a lot of Republicans. And of course, this is a nonpartisan position.
Yeah.
So
for our listeners who haven't been to Roswell, you 100% know it when you're out there.
Yes.
You know that.
Yes. Yeah, you feel it. So, but this position was a nonpartisan position, meaning that you didn't have to be a Democrat or Republican.
Yeah.
So I ran as the mayor. So people would often ask me, well, what party you belong to? I said, neither. I'm an independent, and I am.
Yep.
But then I say, furthermore, it doesn't make any difference because it's a nonpartisan position. Well, people were trying to put me in boxes. So long story short, my opponent, a couple of days before the election, did a robocall. And that means it's a call to tens of thousands of people. And you can determine who these calls go to. And so it went to all white people. And it accused me of being a liberal Democrat amongst some other things. Now, that might seem harmless, but it was very harmful. Because number one, it wasn't true.
Yeah.
And then number two is I had a lot of Republicans and a lot of white people and a lot of older white people who were supporting me. And I was the first, and because many of them told me this, you are the first African American that I've ever voted for in my life.
Wow.
In any race. And I want you to know that I feel so good about this. Well, all you got to do is say, somebody else has to say, well, he's a liberal, or he's a Democrat, or he's a this, or he's a, and I'm not saying anything is wrong with those things per se.
Right.
But those are not good words.
For the Roswell mayoral
election. Okay. And so what it did, it drove some people away from me who were attracted to me for the very first time. And then it stuck. Because it's like, wow, I like this guy, but it makes sense. You know, he's African-American in this. So there were many other things that happened as well. One group thought that, how they thought this, I would never know, but they said that I was not going to stand if I became the mayor. I was not going to stand for the national anthem, and that I was going to take people's guns away, and that I was going to take down all the Confederate monuments in Roswell. Well, there are a couple of problems with that. There are no Confederate monuments.
I was going to say.
That's exactly right.
I don't live in Roswell, but I've been there quite a bit. I don't remember any.
Yeah, so this was a big deal. There are no Confederate monuments. I will stand for the national anthem. And so it was just all kind of stuff. Well, a lot of those things aren't blatantly racist, because you're not calling me the N-word, you're not calling me, but they are racist because you believe the worst in that person.
That's right. Yeah. Easy for white people to believe.
Yes, it's easy for white people to believe. And it's just, so anyway, there were just things like that. And there was some blatant racism too. But for the most part, all you had to do is create doubt about me. And my character and where I stood. And I really am an independent politically. I mean, I don't know what to say except to say that half of my adult life I've voted Republican, and the other probably half I voted Democrat. I don't know. I can't apologize for that.
Right.
So, it just depends on who the candidate is and what the issues are. But so a lot of people just couldn't take that.
So that to me, I would say, was sort of another kind of roller coaster experience where you were invited to enter the race by people who were different from you, saying, Lee, we believe in you. And then you have to experience sort of the racism and the prejudice on the other side. I want to dial this up a little bit just in terms of emotion. Before I ask you about the Thomasville, Georgia incident, Dan, I'm gonna put you on the spot. So for our listeners, Dan is from Colombia.
Yeah, originally from Colombia.
So I'm from Chicago. Lee's from Atlanta. And so one of the things that I've learned with Pastor Lee's help is, and I think this was reinforced in America's Original Sin as well, Lee, if I remember correctly, is that children of color often get the talk from their parents about what happens when you encounter someone from the police. As someone from Colombia, did you have that talk? Did you get that talk?
I got the know where you're at talk. So if, if I'm in a situation, and I know that I'm a little outnumbered, then for sure, shut up. Don't talk.
Gotcha.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Keep quiet. And I keep it today. I don't call police. I do not think about calling the police at all. I can't even imagine a situation where I would. I really can't.
Yeah.
I mean,
and this is the reason I call this one out is because if you don't believe that people of color have had different experiences in this country, that's a very simple one. Your pool experience is a very simple one where as a child, which is when you're most impressionable, this idea, my parents never had to sit me down and say, if you encounter the police, this is what you need to do or not do or say or not say or what have you.
Are you ever nervous when you get when a cop's behind you?
Always. Yeah. Just because I think I'll get a ticket. I think there's exactly.
So that's interesting. You're nervous because you think you'll get a ticket. I'm nervous because of other reasons.
Right.
I think I might get killed.
Yeah. And so that was sort of my lead into Thomasville, Georgia. And I don't think that one hit the national scene. No. And when you told me about it, I was like, geez, this sounds... you can't say just as bad because they're all bad, right? But this was also a scenario where a little bit of reconciliation happened after an awful situation. So can you unpack for our listeners, if you don't mind, what happened in Thomasville, Georgia?
Thomasville, Georgia, South Georgia. There was an African-American guy. Let's just say he was a drug dealer, something like this. Not a big time drug dealer, but let's just say a guy selling marijuana out of his home. The police come to the home. He sees the police coming and he jumps in his car and tries to get away. The policemen jump in their car. They begin to follow him. They call for some reinforcement and he goes down the street and the street is blocked. So now he's blocked. He's caged in by the cars. And he stops and the policemen come out with their guns pointed, which they should, and they say, stop the car, and which it was already stopped. And then the car moves about, oh my God, maybe 6 inches, no more than a foot. And they opened fire. And I mean a slowly moving car. So they killed him. And this was right in front of people, in front of children and everybody. And the neighbors the kids saw it. They were wailing, the people who witnessed this. And they were like, he stopped. He did everything y'all told him to do. He stopped. And they said the car moved. Well, your car can move when you put it in park. That's exactly right. And it was one of those deals. And so there was a lot of tension. It never made the national news, but it should have.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there was a lot of division in the community. And this large white Presbyterian church decided that they were going to try to be a unifier in the community. And they called a rally at this white church and invited some of the other predominantly African-American churches in the city. A lot of them didn't show up, but many of them did. And I was the keynote speaker.
Wow.
And I talked about the whole Samaritan woman story and talked about race and talked about my story. And it was just a wonderful time of worship, of prayer and hugging and crying. And so that was my story, going down there. It was an honor to be chosen by these people to come and to help with this.
So I want to kind of wrap this up with you having the opportunity to talk about your approach. And I think our listeners are starting to get a feel for your spirit already. But I want to go back to the story of the Good Samaritan. And I read an article online from Franciscan Media. So some Franciscan monks have a online magazine, and there was a story about the history of the Jews and Samaritans, and the analogies that were given were street gangs in New York or Los Angeles, the Muslims and the Serbs in Bosnia, the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. Like, these were the analogies given to the kind of hatred and tension between Jews and Samaritans. And yet in one of the most famous parables ever spoken by Jesus, if you Google Good Samaritan, you get over 30 million results online. He's got a story about engaging and collaborating and caring. And in all the time that I've known you, despite all these stories and despite your experiences and despite death threats and despite shootings, you have an approach that you're asking white people, and I know you're asking a lot of other things, but you're asking white people to engage with the African-American community and to understand and to listen and to believe and to defend. Tell our listeners, Lee, where does this come from, and how do you continue to stay on this path that you're on for reconciliation?
Well, I believe it is the heart of Jesus. I believe reconciliation is what we have in terms of our faith in Jesus. We were reconciled back to God through Jesus Christ. And so I think the whole theme of reconciliation is not only a vertical issue, meaning our relationship with Christ, but it is also a horizontal issue. Because even Jesus says, what are the two greatest commandments? Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So,
and you don't get to pick the color of your neighbor.
That's right.
You don't get to pick the religion of your neighbor. You don't get to pick the gender of your neighbor.
That's right.
Your neighbor is your neighbor.
That's right. And then, of course, Jesus led into the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
All right. So here's what I tell many white people, and it is this. First of all, you're not better or you're not worse because you're white. You're not better or worse because you're black. But when you are the majority culture, when you have most of the power, when you have most of the population, and when you have most of the wealth, you can get basically you don't have to get to know anybody else's perspective if you don't want to, because most things in America are built around the white culture. And I'm not saying that's good or bad or indifferent. It's just the truth.
The facts.
Yeah. But it would be the same way if black people were the majority culture and had the majority wealth. Okay. So one of the statements that I make is I say, you will never care about black people or Hispanic people or people unless you first care about a person. So if you don't have a person in your life, a real person, then when you turn on the news and you see two black guys unarmed getting shot, well, to many people, that was just another person who deserved to be killed because they were a thug and they were running from the police or they didn't comply.
Yeah.
And there was no compassion or very little. Why? Because you don't know them and you don't know people like them. But something happens when you know people, when you understand their life and their story. So how I would start with people is through personal relationships. Yeah. And the only way a personal relationship can be successful is you have to first listen.
Yeah.
So I have these 4 or 5 things that I would tell whites when it came to this issue of racial reconciliation. First is listen to us. And by the way, it takes a lot of humility to listen to somebody's story. And now when you listen, you can't say, yeah, but No, that's not listening. That's just waiting until it's your turn to rebut what they're saying.
Yeah.
Listening is meaning you put yourself in their shoes. Okay. Then the second thing is believe us. So listen to us, believe us. And I would tell many of my friends who are white, guys, this police issue has been around forever. This is not anything new to us. And so, but they just had a completely different experience than what we had. So believe us. And then thirdly, befriend us. Because once you become a person's friend, then you care about what they care about. When they hurt, you hurt.
Yeah.
And when you hurt, they hurt. And then fourthly, stand up for us. Once you know the truth and you care about people, then you just don't let other people say certain things and do certain things. You stand up.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of walk people through that 4-step process. But it starts with number one, listening, and that was the hardest part.
Yeah. And I know we're running long, Dan, so don't get mad at me, but I feel like there's maybe an extra message for the church here. There's a couple things that have happened in your and I's relationship that have been extremely powerful. One is you're available to me. And you're obviously a very clear, objective thinker about this really difficult issue. And I called you or texted you regarding kind of a blow up that we had in the Christian community where some people were at odds with one another online. Of course, nobody's listening to anybody over something that happened at an award show. And so part of me thinks about, well, what are all the people doing that don't have Pastor Jenkins to call? And the second thing, and then you can maybe just give us maybe a stronger message to believers. But what first drew Rhonda and I to Eagle's Nest was something that you told me a number of years ago that was very impactful. And you said, David, the idea of multi-ethnic church, multiracial church is white people expecting people of color to worship like they do.
That's right.
And you said very rarely are people going the other direction. And that drew me to Eagle's Nest, and our experience at Eagle's Nest has been phenomenal. So hit the Christians maybe a little harder, if you don't mind, on this issue of really working at this.
Yes.
And what do they do if they don't have Pastor Jenkins to call?
Wow. And it does take a lot of work. It has to be very intentional.
I agree with that.
Let me go back to the story when Jesus came. This is not the Good Samaritan. This is more Jesus when he dealt with the Samaritan woman.
Yeah.
And Jews and Samaritans didn't deal with each other. But Jesus said, I must go through Samaria.
That's right.
I believe it's John chapter 4. In other words, Jesus was intentional. Most Orthodox Jews avoided Samaria.
Right.
But Jesus says, I must go through Samaria.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of subject that you have to be intentional about.
Yeah. And aren't we called to do this?
And we're called
because
to do
of John
this.
chapter 4?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're called to be salt and light to the earth. So if there's a problem, we're supposed to make it better. We're supposed to bring more flavor. We're supposed to, but we are the worst example of this.
Yeah.
Christians are.
Yeah.
So I often challenge many white people, particularly white Christians, with what I'm about to say. Now, it's a little easier, what I'm about to say, for minorities, because when you are a minority, you are used to assimilating.
Yeah.
In fact, because that's what being a minority is all about. That's why you're a minority. You are outnumbered. You have to assimilate into sometimes a culture that you might not be your preference, whether it's music, whether it's it's a part of being a minority. And by the way, that makes most people better and more well-rounded. So that's not a complaint. Assimilation.
Good point. The
problem is when you're in the majority culture, you don't have to assimilate. You can go to the same all-white schools, live in the same all-white neighborhood, have the same all-white friends, go to the same all-white church, and live your entire life like that and rarely miss a beat.
Yeah.
So when we do see diversity in most churches, it is because, for the most part, the minorities did most of the hard work.
Yeah.
It is because the minorities were the ones who were more intentional about it. That is, they came into a white environment and became a member and assimilated.
Yeah.
But you very rarely see the majority culture, which is white, coming into a minority environment and assimilating. And I believe it needs to be a two-way street and not just a one-way street.
Yeah.
I celebrate when anybody comes together and unifies, but it has mostly been the minority culture assimilating into the majority instead of the other way around. So at our church, we have opened our arms to white people and invited them, what we say, to the party.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And literally that's how we talk. Come, we want you to know the doors are open, but we think it's important that we don't change too much. Now, I know that doesn't sound, but yeah, because there is something for us to learn from each other. And most of the time when you get white people who are the majority and they have the majority power, majority wealth, then they make the rules. So even in churches, the music, everything, all the little nuances, well, this is the dominant culture, so this is the way we're going to do it. Well, that devalues anybody else that wants to do it a different way. So I am really trying hard to see diversity go the other way as well. So Christians ought to be leading. So what I challenge many of my white brothers and sisters to do is simply this, to get out of their comfort zone.
Right.
To do it intentionally. And I'm telling you, it'll be difficult in some areas, but it will make their lives so much better. Mm-hmm. And they'll be able to understand, and really they'll just be a better Christian and a better person because of it.
Yeah. Well, that's so good. Well, I think we probably have to wrap, Dan, but Pastor Lee, if you don't mind, not everybody is as fortunate as I am that I can text you, you know, on a moment's notice. But how might people find more materials from you or resources from you or follow you?
They can go follow me on social media at Lee Allen Jenkins. That's ALLEN, Lee Allen Jenkins. And that's on Facebook, that's on Instagram, that's on Twitter. Or you can go to my website, leejenkinsgroup.com. Or just go to eaglesnestchurch.org.
There you go.
Yes.
Outstanding. For those of you that want to follow him on Twitter, you're going to get a lot of Tennessee volunteer stuff, so you have to put up with that. But everything else is really good. Well, Pastor Lee, Dan and I can't thank you enough for joining us this afternoon. And man, I'm just so encouraged by the work that you're doing and your heart and the salt and light. Scripture is so right, and you're just doing that in this community and around the nation, and I just hope people will take some time to listen.
Wow. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thanks, guys. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.